Greetings everyone, welcome to another operations video. In this video we'll be discussing supply chain management, looking at 6 strategies. So when we discuss supply chain management, ultimately the goal of managing the supply chain is ensuring that we are providing the most value for our customer. And that idea of value is really dependent on the mission of your company and your organization. And we'll look at some examples in just one moment. So with this video, our specific goal is to explain 6 supply chain strategies. We see them listed here. Let's go ahead and get into number 1, which is outsourcing. So what do we mean by outsourcing? Well, usually what we're discussing is the idea of transferring, a traditional activity that an organization might incur, might be part of their business, and they're going to choose to actually outsource or request a third party do that activity for them. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Let's look at an example that might help us have a better understanding. Great article in Hotelier magazine called The Case for Outsourcing, and it compares the Fairmont Pacific Rim to the Holiday Inn Express. And it's so great, I'm going to encourage you to pause this video and read the article. All right, welcome back. You've read the article. So now we should have an understanding of what they're outsourcing, okay? And which hotel decides to outsource, which hotel decides not to outsource. So again, referencing that article, you should have an understanding of what are some of the reasons why we might decide to outsource. And of course, usually number 1 reason is that it's cheaper to outsource, and it depends on the situation, as you read in the article. And again, you can see some of these reasons specifically in the article, particularly on the idea that relieving the activity to the professionals if we're outsourcing it, and we have the opportunity to rely more on what we're really good at when it comes to maybe handling the guests, spending more time with the guests. Okay, so compare that article to these reasons, and you should see some alignment there. So that's what we mean by outsourcing. Great example in your article. Let's take a look at number 2, which is many suppliers. So this is another strategy where, quite frankly, as the name suggests, you're going to rely on lots of suppliers to provide your product or service. So let's look at another example here. And this time we're going to discuss Walmart. So a little story about Walmart and their suppliers. We'll start with Tide. Of course, most people are familiar with Tide detergent. I guess we're still on the laundry theme here, but now we're talking about our own laundry. So what's interesting about this story is that Tide has always been carried at Walmart. Walmart had them as a supplier, but only recently did Walmart decide to bring in Purcell. And Purcell is a little less known company. And the reason why they brought them in is not only just to have more variety, but the idea is they knew that Purcell was cheaper than Tide. So what had happened is that Tide felt pressure to start competing with Purcell and offered a lower price. Okay, so oftentimes this is some of the reasons why, or characteristics of having many suppliers. Okay, and again, think about Walmart. What is their mission? Well, it's to offer that cheapest price possible, so it really aligns well with their strategy. So again, when we're looking at many suppliers, some of the characteristics is the idea that the actual product itself is quite homogeneous or a commodity, just like what we're talking about with laundry detergent. And again, Walmart is going to only purchase suppliers that can offer a very low price. And in this case, just like most times with many suppliers, the suppliers themselves now have to start competing with one another. So it's not typically a lot of loyalty, really just about price. It can get a little bit kind of treacherous in terms of the relationships they have. Okay, now we'll switch to a different strategy. Our third strategy is maybe using a few suppliers supply chain strategy. Now in this case, again, as the name suggests, you're really limiting your amount of supplier options for a particular good or service. Okay. Now, what's an example, or what type of restaurant or organization might do something like this? Well, example here is a restaurant called Blue Hills Restaurant. This is one of Dan Barber's restaurants. What's interesting about this restaurant is that there really isn't a menu. Okay, the menu is basically whatever is grown within the farm, and they have a few suppliers that are very specific, and we'll take a look at some examples later on. But the idea with this supply chain strategy is, again, it's a very particular amount of supply that they have, so much that they really can only offer what is available to their farm, so much so that they can't even offer a menu. And it's sometimes been criticized, but again, it works for their type of organization. They're very farm to table, very sustainably focused type of restaurant. So this applies and aligns well with their strategy. So just another example, again, so if we looked at their menus, quote unquote, because they don't really have a specific menu, but for instance, if they were offering mushrooms on their menu, they have a very specific supplier. And this gentleman from Forest Harvest, he's the only one that supplies their mushrooms to Blue Hill. So he's an exclusive supplier of mushrooms. So again, a really clear example of how specific and few type of supplier they have. And some of the challenges with having few suppliers is sometimes there might not be enough product to provide the company. Okay, so that's something we have to think about if you want to have few suppliers, and if you want to have those super local, maybe 100-mile diet or 100-mile source food. Is that sustainable? So you have to think about that again. Now, Blue Hill is very intelligent, the idea that they don't actually have a menu, so they're not obligated to provide a specific dish. So that's a good way to deal with that challenge. But of course, again, given the type of restaurant, type of organization they are, this aligns very well with their other operational decisions. Okay, so that's what we mean by few suppliers. And often that product is very unique. Price is not really the factor here. It's more about providing a very unique experience, just like this restaurant would provide. So, number 4 in terms of supply chain management is this idea of vertical integration. So this is almost like the opposite of outsourcing. So what we're doing here is that we're actually developing the ability for the organization itself to provide their own experience or their own activities or their own products. Okay, so let's stick to Blue Hills and we'll use an example here. So Blue Hills, for instance, believe it or not, they actually they sell their own yogurts. Okay, now typically, when you make yogurt, of course, you need milk and other products, and most places would purchase milk outside of their own organization. But what they've done is actually they grow, they have their cattle there, and they actually produce their own milk for their yogurt. Okay, so that's an example of vertical integration. The idea is you're basically actually shrinking the supply chain to the point where you're actually using all of your products to make the final product. So that's one example of vertical integration. Okay, a little more notes on integration. It can be forward or backwards. Okay, and we'll take a look at an example in just a second. Now, why would we consider vertical integration? Well, again, eventually, ideally, it might help with costs because you're not outsourcing as much. We'll talk about that in a moment. But really, the main reason typically when it comes to vertical integration is a lot to do with quality. Okay, so that you have more control of the overall product. And typically that might contribute to a better quality product. Okay, but of course with that you obviously need to have, in terms of capital, you need to have land to actually raise the cattle so you can actually farm that milk. So you can imagine how much capital that's required. And of course you need the skills to be able to do that. So it does take a little bit more investment. So let's look at some other examples here. So again, we talked about forward and backward integration. Okay, so in this case here, let's use Pepsi as an example. What do we mean by forward integration? So again, what forward means is how much closer it is to the end user. Okay, so of course when Pepsi makes their product, they actually bottle it themselves. Okay, so that's an example of forward integration. And now let's talk about backwards integration. So this is something quite recent with Apple, for instance. Before they used to require or rely on Intel to make their own chips, or to make their chips, pardon me, for their computers. But recently now they have their own chips, the M1, M2, and so forth. So that's an example of backward integration, right? Now, obviously those chips aren't going to the end user, but they help us make those computers. So that's what we mean by backwards integration, okay? But overall, whether it's forward or backward, you can see that the ideal scenario is to be able to have control over all of the parts of the supply chain, okay? Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. But again, typically when it comes to vertical integration, they're usually big companies like Pepsi and Apple. They have a lot of capital, and they've gained a lot of experience throughout the years. So they realize, now I can make my own chips, or I have enough product like Pepsi it makes sense to have my own bottling facilities. So that's usually what you'll see with vertical integration. Companies that are a lot more experienced, have a lot more capital, and they're ready to expand their operation. Our next supply chain strategy is joint ventures. Okay, so now it's this idea of sort of collaborating with another company. Okay, so we're cooperating, but we're not typically when we collaborate, we're collaborating with people that aren't exactly competing for the same guests or products. Okay, or creating the same products. Okay, so we don't want to actually try and dilute our opportunities or our market share. So there isn't that competitive conflict there. Okay, so let's look at an example here on joint ventures. This is an interesting one. It's going on for years now. Still continues. This idea with Starbucks and PepsiCo. Okay, they've actually since I believe 2014 or 2015, they've joined together so that they can offer coffees. Maybe it's like iced coffees and things like that in all around the world. Now, why would they do something like this? Well, if you think of Starbucks as the experts in coffee, okay, and you think of PepsiCo as the experts in distribution of beverages, it makes sense because ultimately what you have are two experts in whether it's the actual product itself or the distribution of that product, and they're joining each other. And that way, what ends up happening is you have a successful collaboration. Okay, so and again, we don't necessarily think Starbucks and Pepsi are going to go head to head because they offer different products. Okay, but there is enough similarity there that it can help with the expansion. So again, Starbucks needs PepsiCo to help expand, and PepsiCo helps or needs Starbucks with their sort of expertise in coffee. Okay. Another fun example here is this happened a couple of years ago, but Apple and Mario, or Nintendo, I guess to be more specific, Nintendo had launched their first mobile game app, and of course, who did they team up with? Well, they teamed up with Apple because again, Apple is that real expert when it comes to apps and mobile games, and of course, some might argue that Nintendo is very much the expert in creating the actual games. So again, when it comes to distribution of that games, Nintendo really wanted to collaborate with a company that is very experienced in distribution of those games. Okay, so again, when we think about why you would have a joint venture, as we've sort of mentioned before, it's this idea of enhancing your skills, enhancing the knowledge that you would gain from the other organization. Okay, sometimes it might be a matter of securing supply. So if you do collaborate with this company, then that you for instance, again, if PepsiCo wanted to secure a supply of coffee distribution, then of course Starbucks would be a great example to do so. And also the idea of reducing your costs. So again, you think about PepsiCo, they already have a really great distribution system already. They have bottling plants and so forth. So Starbucks wouldn't have to invest a lot of capital in creating all that. So in other words, they don't really have to reinvent the wheel. It's already there for them. Okay, so it's a great way to reduce the cost. Same with if you think about Nintendo. they don't have a lot of experience or a lot of capital invested in mobile games. So why not use a device or a vehicle like Apple that already has that established? Okay, so that is another example of supply chain strategies. And then finally, we have number 6 is, you can go a little bit more virtual. Okay, maybe you're really reducing your supply chain. So what do we mean by virtual strategy? Is, again, the idea is you're not actually using your own supply chain. You're relying on other suppliers, lots of other suppliers. So many suppliers, they're double, okay, rely on a variety of suppliers, supplier relationships to provide service or good or service, okay? So in other words, you're minimizing what investment or capital you need as an organization, and you're relying a whole bunch on other suppliers. What's an interesting example? Well, sure, we're all familiar with this logo here, okay? Airbnb is just one of the masters in doing this. If you think about the company, they really don't have a lot of capital. Even though they offer all these accommodations, they don't actually have any, physical buildings that they've invested in. What do they rely on? They rely on the suppliers of all of their, quote unquote hosts to be able to provide that supply chain, which is the actual rooms. And they don't have a lot of capital in regards to what they actually own. So a lot of times, a lot of digital companies can be one of these virtual companies that really just exist as almost a communicator or an organization or organizer to get the actual product to the guests. Okay, so a good example is Airbnb. And again, what are some of the advantages of a virtual company? Well, of course, again, they can be very responsive, right? And again, a very low capital investment. And again, they can be flexible just depending on the demand, because they don't need to, reinvest any capital or borrow a lot of money in order to make changes to their strategy. Okay, so those have been the 6 supply chain strategies. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you shortly.